Okay, good morning all. Can you hear me clearly? So I'll turn this down. Great. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Catherine Kenyon. I'm the project manager for the Transforming Surge Capacity project. I'm going to hand over to Glenn O'Neill in a moment to lead the webinar, but just on behalf of the project, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I know I have a selection of people in the room with me listening into the webinar, and we have also a lot of people joining online. Just to recap, so I think most of you are aware, the webinar is looking at the surge response for the 2016 Bangladesh flood response. And it's actually, I believe, the third in a series of reports which have been collated by the project, providing snapshots of how agencies are responding to recent emergencies with their surge systems. For those of you who don't know, the Transforming Surge Capacity project, it's a 3-year project, and it's looking at piloting and building evidence on new approaches to surge capacity. And we're particularly interested in looking at how agencies can scale up their responses in more localised and collaborative ways. Most of our piloting happens in 2 national bases in Pakistan and the Philippines, and also an Asia regional hub. This particular report was obviously based in Bangladesh, where we don't have a hub, but it's obviously in a region that we're particularly focused on. I'm also really pleased, I believe then we've also got some of the kind of people who were directly involved in the research piece from Bangladesh online today to also talk through some of their experiences, as well as you talking through the report with us. Is that right? Glenn, can you hear me? Yes, I believe. Great.
Yes, that's right. Yes, thanks.
Okay, super. Okay, so Glenn, I'll hand over to you in a moment, but obviously a big thanks from my side for leading the piece of research. So for those of you who don't know, Glenn works with the CHS Alliance on the research component for the project alongside Lois Austin. So a big thanks to you for working on this report for us, and without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Kat. So once again, welcome everyone. I think you can hear me all. As Kat said, I led the research piece looking at the Bangladesh floods. And basically, I'm just going to, for the start, what we're going to do is I'm going to make a very short presentation summarizing the main points of our research. And then I will basically hand over also to the colleagues, if the colleagues are online who were involved in the response in Bangladesh, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So let's get going. I'll just show you my presentation. Hopefully you can see it about now. Kat, can you nod your head? Can you see it? Yes, thanks, great. Okay, so basically, as Kat said, this was a research piece on the response to the Bangladesh floods. And here, as you can see, the report actually is available online to download for everyone. And as Kat said, it's part of a tracking mechanism that we do for the Surge project, which is going over 3 years and is concluding this first phase at the end of this year. So we really focus looking at how did the 11 operational agencies of this project respond to the Bangladesh floods. You can see them all in the report down the bottom here, where I put my mouse: ActionAid, Muslim Aid, CAFOD, etc., CARE, SAVE, Islamic Relief, etc., just to name a few of them. So basically, when I go through the report, I basically when I talk about agencies, I'm mainly talking about these agencies and also their partners, as many work through local partners in the response. So just keep that in mind. So as we say there, you know, we did a survey of 7 of the agencies, and basically out of our operational agencies, we have 11 as part of this project, or 10 out of 11 were active. So we also look at how they all basically responded to the floods. And as I said on this last point here, the report, we don't claim to cover all of the surge response to the floods. Of course, we looked at what others were doing and what they did, government, Red Cross, Red Crescent, other NGOs, UN, but of course, our main focus was on these 11 agencies and partners that are part of this project. So just keep that in mind. From this point, let's look at a brief review. So as we describe in the report, in last year in July, August, flooding hit central and northern Bangladesh, as you can see on the map, the darker areas. Over 3.7 million people were affected. Hundreds of thousands had to flee their homes. And there was massive damage was caused to crops, houses, and infrastructure. And that, of course, had implications once the flood waters receded for the recovery, and that's also an issue we'll talk a bit about today. So that's a basic description of what happened. It was in an area, also areas that were relatively remote, river delta areas with islands, which also made responding more challenging. Now, a couple of points on how actually did organizations, including agents of this project, local partners responded. Basically, government, civil society mobilized relatively quickly. The government released funds to support its regional authorities, local authorities, and they've managed to evacuate nearly over 600,000 people. The system in place, the Humanitarian Coordination Task Team, led by the UN, NGOs, and government, also came into action quickly in early August. And one of the decisions was to carry out a rapid needs assessment. And this was led by CARE Bangladesh and done in a collaborative way. So that was a positive response in that regard. And also when we look at how the response was then carried out, a lot of the agencies, organizations, local organizations referred to this initial needs assessment led by CARE Bangladesh. And this was also presented to the main government departments responsible, the Department of Disaster Management, of the Ministry of Disaster Management, and also formed a large basis for their response. Also, the response really benefited from the presence of NGOs and government staff across the affected area. Many of the agencies that are part of this project had existing partnerships with local organizations which really supported their response. For example, Plan International, one of the agencies of the project, had over 30 local partners, already partnerships set up. So that really supported the response. Here we have a little bit more about, how did the actual response, when we mean surge response, sorry, I forgot to mention, we're talking about the initial emergency response to the crisis, in this time, the flood. So how do agencies mobilize extra resources, people, resources, skills to respond? So that's what we mean by surge, humanitarian surge, just to be clear. I didn't mention that at the very start. So that's really what we looked at. The humanitarian emergency response in the first couple of weeks is what we're talking about. So interestingly, in this response, based on our research, the response by the 10 agencies and partners that we looked at was led by 100% national staff. So there was no foreign, regional, international staff flown in by the agencies that we worked with, which is quite different from other past disasters. Also reflects the scale of the disaster and the capacity of the NGOs, government, local partners, civil society on the ground in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a quite strong civil society and NGO network. Although agencies deployed mainly male staff, from our accounts, from what we looked at, about just over 70%. What was interesting was that the response was actually focused on female-led responses at the local level in many cases. For example, one of our partners one of our agencies, Christian Aid, with their local partner, GUK, G-U-K, led a female-led response at the local level, as did Action Aid, who had an 85% female search team, and they used their model of women-led emergency responses. So these examples also, and you can see the quote on the side, sorry, just go back, of a first responder, a local responder, talking about the role of women in the response in Bangladesh. In terms of the sort of sectors that agencies reacted, the main area where agencies were active was in food security and livelihoods. The agencies working with this project. The use of cash programming was important. For example, according to the statistics of the food cluster, 85% of assistance was actually in cash. So that's an interesting point also. The funding was an issue to fund, of course, the response. And certainly for our agencies involved, funding from the START Fund, which is part of the START Network, which is the funder of this project, was key for agencies. Just for your background, the START Network allocated several 500,000 British pounds, which is about 600,000 US dollars. And for example, Caritas Bangladesh was able to receive 124,000 US dollars. And also some of our other agencies, Action Against Hunger, CARE, Christian Aid, Islamic Relief, Save the Children, and their partners all benefited from this funding. And this was actually the first time that a local based national NGO, Caritas Bangladesh, received funding directly from the START Fund. There were other donors involved. At the same time, the UN launched a humanitarian response plan seeking 13 million US dollars, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent also launched a plan for 1.6 million. This was, of course, positive, but at the same time, agencies did report, as we'll see in a minute, challenges in terms of funding, and particularly funding to report the early recovery phase. Now, in terms of collaboration, all the agencies we spoke to and surveyed reported a collaborative approach in response to the floods. This was certainly encouraged by existing clients, partners, and networks, as I mentioned before. And even amongst our agencies, we saw a lot of collaboration with local, national partners, also our own agencies. For example, Christian Aid, Muslim Aid, and Action Aid jointly implemented a response in different areas. This was supported by the carrying out initially by CARE of the Joint Rapid Needs Assessment, cited as a positive collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, of course, the existing network of government agencies, preparedness, national organizations also supported this. Now, many organizations, NGOs that have links or are part of global or regional networks said that their global regional networks, they didn't send staff on the ground. More so, as I mentioned before, more so they helped by providing visibility, technical support, and funding. Or they helped to support to find funding. So that was a positive collaboration in that regard. For example, Plan International regional office helped to find funding for the response in Bangladesh, working with partners in their partners in the UK and the US. Now, basically the challenges. What were the challenges? And here you can see there's a reason. Those are in bold: funding and early recovery. As I hinted at or mentioned directly, funding was one of the key challenges. Although the START funding and other donors, the government released funding, funding remained a key challenge for many of the organizations. One organization, responded that the initial rapid needs assessment looked at providing support for 3 months. One agency said, based on their funding, they could only provide funding for 1 month. So, of course, funding was an issue, and also linked to early recovery. as we could see at the very start of the presentation, there were, of course, issues that once the waters had receded, really many hundreds of thousands were affected by livelihoods, and that was going to be an issue for the long-term recovery. So many of the organizations struggled to put in exit strategies and to have an early recovery funding and approach. This is also, as I mentioned we mentioned in the report, compounded by the fact that many communities affected relied on agricultural activities, mainly livestock, and these were extensively damaged, destroyed during the floods. So this was a sort of a major concern. Other less concerns in terms of staff. Some agencies reported difficulty finding and deploying trained staff to the response. Although it was generally positive. Access, there were some issues of access to some areas to get the permission of the authorities to go. And also it was challenging given the remote communities that were sometimes only accessible by boat. Procurement also was an issue for some in that they could benefit from pre-positioned stocks and in-country supplies. However, some materials needed to be purchased locally, and that was difficult, such as tarpaulins, plastic sheeting, and that had to be done in Dhaka, the capital, because it wasn't available locally. So on this basis, that's a very rapid assessment and overview of the main findings of our report. Now, where does that lead us in terms of recommendations? And I'll just go through several of all of the key recommendations, basically, that comes out of this review. Firstly, deployment and response for all actors. This was a positive example where all actors, government, UN, NGOs, local partners, work together in the assessment phase. So this seems obvious, but it doesn't always happen in these sort of situations. And this is sort of what we would say, of course, to be encouraged. In many deployments, agencies struggle to deploy female staff and support women-led responses. In Bangladesh, there was positive example seen of how women-led responses could work effectively, and of course that's to be encouraged. Funding was an issue, and the fact that national NGOs and therefore their local partners could have access directly to funding, and that's what we mean by the abbreviation local and national NGOs. In similar crises, this is really to be, of course, encouraged, what comes out of our findings. In terms of staff and setup, we would encourage, of course, given the positive examples, to integrate further skills training for staff and partners, because many of the partners are jumping in from other development and resilience activities. So if staff surge training was available more so for them, would also be beneficial. And also from the agencies, so we're talking about the large NGOs, to build more partnerships to facilitate surge response. That was positive in many cases in Bangladesh, that there was this response. There was the response seen in terms of, there was the positive experience seen in terms of partnerships that were existing before, and that really helped facilitate the response. And then on the last point, collaboration, there's very positive experiences seen in Bangladesh with the collaboration between NGOs, UN, government agencies, local partners, first responders. And so, of course, we think that other contexts can certainly learn from this. Early recovery, this was a major challenge, and certainly, the big NGOs, agency, UN, they have to review their exit and early recovery strategies to also have an emphasis on that, because that seems to have been a weakness in this response. And secondly, of course, strategies for early recovery rely on funding, and this, of course, would be helped if donors and agencies could also, step up and look at their funding for these key elements, particularly in such natural disasters where flooding, where there is a significant amount of damage, and recovering from the floods does take time. So this is a brief overview of the response. Our research on the response, you can see here, you can download the report directly, and we encourage you to share it, and yes, dig into more of the details in the response. Now, on this stage, I'll stop sharing my screen and basically maybe ask if there's anyone online also from Bangladesh who participated in the response. It'd be interesting, before we open it up to questions, to hear from people who are directly involved. Maybe, hopefully, you'll confirm what we've been saying. If you have other aspects to mention, that would be really great. So I'll just hand it back to Kat, and then we'll see if we have other people that would like to say something. If you just put yourself forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Glenn, for that very clear summary. So, as Glenn mentioned, it would be great to hear if we do have anyone online who was kind of directly involved in the Bangladesh response or in the research piece. If there's anything you would like to add or reflect. I think, have you unmuted everyone now? Is everyone unmuted? So that if somebody wants to speak, they can.
Yeah, everyone is on mute.
Oh, everyone is on mute. Okay, so you might need to just flag in the messenger bar if you would like to chip in, and we can unmute you, and you can have a chance to share any reflections that you have. Okay. In which case, it might take we'll give it a bit of time to get the ball rolling. Maybe, Glenn, we can open it up to wider questions or reflections. Would that be okay from your side?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so are there any questions for Glenn? Yes, please. Great. Sam. So we have Samantha, Deb. Do you want to... Would it work? Sorry, I've got Kadir who is... There we go. So Sam, you should be unmuted and able to talk to the group.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you. Yes. Hi.
Yeah. Hi, I'm a former Save the Children staff member that was working on preparedness and emergency response in Myanmar. Thanks very much for the presentation. Save the Children Myanmar was really lucky to receive unrestricted funding for preparedness. My question really is about the donor environment in looking at building up this surge support and surge capacity with funding so tight all around the world. Do we see something coming out from donors around preparedness so that we can increase surge capacity globally, particularly in Asia and Pacific regions?
Thanks, Sam. Maybe Kat, do you have more insights on that? I mean, I can say something, but I just think that, yeah, very briefly, that what we have seen is that there is some funding move with the whole localization, and of course, disaster preparedness has been on the agenda for many, many years and comes in sort of waves. But I don't know if we've really seen any impact of that yet. I don't know, Kat, you're more closer to the funding streams.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly from the project's perspective, so just to give you a bit of background, the project is kind of gathering learning over the last 3 years, and we're pulling that together into a kind of full learning piece that we want to share later this year. And absolutely, one of the core recommendations that we can see emerging is absolutely on funding relating to preparedness and specifically for surge, and actually saying to agencies and their donors that we think much more needs to be done in terms of investment on surge systems, and particularly for localized surge systems. So this project was funded via the START network, but by funding from DFID, but part of our encouragement, this certainly this project anyway ends at the end of this year, is actually to encourage further investment in this area, because we see it obviously ultimately paying off in terms of better responses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just for your reference as well, so there's another piece of research actually that the project is conducting on financial sustainability for Surge, which will be released over the next month or so, which we can also circulate to interested members, which kind of goes into a bit more detail into kind of sustainable funding models for Surge, and gives a bit, it's kind of including a mapping piece on donors and their interest in funding this area. So yeah, watch this space, there will be more information coming shortly.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions, either from anyone in the room who here with me now or online?
Could I ask Glenn about some of the recommendations?
Sure. You might need to come a bit closer to the mic. Sorry, Claire. Yes, that would be fantastic.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi.
Hi, it's Claire from ActionAid. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I was particularly interested in some of the recommendations around the women-led response that you'd mentioned. It seemed like that was successful in this particular response, and I wondered if you had any more analysis as to why that was the case. And another part of that question, just to see if there was any more reflections on the cash aspect of that, and if that, in particular, women leading that aspect of the response. If you could more details.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think at the start, firstly, there's a couple of factors. If we look at the success factors, why the women-led response worked. The first thing is that the organizations that we mentioned that we know had women-led responses, Christian Aid, ActionAid, actually have a, how can we say it? They have a programming approach in this way. So it's really at the policy level. So it's not just left up to the staff on the ground. It's really coming from the top in a way that which of course in Bangladesh can be a challenge, because I think it's not a secret to say it could be considered patriarchal society in many ways. People correct me if I'm wrong. So there's challenges in doing that. Secondly, if we look at the local partners and those who actually helped, a lot are led by women. So women-led NGOs and civil society groups are very strong from what we saw, and so that's certainly helped in that regard. So I think these aspects, to have this as a deliberate policy approach, really helps. So it's not ad hoc. And secondly, deliberately also partnering with women-led organizations. In terms of like the cash aspect, I think that's an interesting one. From what we heard, but we didn't investigate it in depth, but certainly some of the distribution of cash and other non-food and food items was led in some cases, in some districts, by women that were involved in the distribution and selection of the people who would receive the assistance. So women were involved in that regard, as previous research that I've seen has shown that actually women make better choices in terms of selection of beneficiaries, affected people, because they are closer to the communities than men in that regard. Also, there's another point on cash that just left my mind. But yeah, this was sort of, I think, the main points that also that we heard and that we saw. Once again, other colleagues online might have more to add.
Thanks very much, Glenn. So any further questions from anyone online or in the room? Saskia, sorry, yes, we haven't heard from Saskia. Saskia, we'll just make sure you're unmuted. There we go. So Saskia, the floor is yours if you would like to ask a question. we'll come back to you. I mean, Glenn, I did have a question for you, which is just on the, you know, the levels of collaboration that you heard on from this response. So I'm conscious that Bangladesh is one of the countries where the DEP program is based, so the Disasters Emergency Preparedness Program, and our surge project is one of the projects within the DEP. And I just wondered, when you interviewed people about the collaboration, was it, you know, something you talked about the kind of the relationships that had, you know, already existed? Was that something that had been built over a long period of time, or was any of that attributed to the work of the DEP, which I know actually only initiated in 2015, but it would be interesting if that was referred to or not.
Thanks, Kat. I mean, it's I would say it's hard for us to tell. I think certainly, you know, the organizations that did work together, I think certainly like Christian Aid, Muslim Aid, Action Against Hunger, that did work together, as did some of the others. I think they were partly brought together because of their work through the START network. At the same time, many of them were also already working together through the cluster system, food security cluster, which seems to be relatively strong in Bangladesh. So there was already sort of networks and existing relationships, I believe, that were then reinforced by the START network, from what I've seen. That's what I think. Yes.
Okay, super. Thanks, Glenn, for that response. And sorry, just from my side, very selfishly, I did have a follow-up question as well, which is you know, in the surge projects itself, one of the things that we've been piloting is collaborative rosters in Pakistan and the Philippines. So the idea is, particularly where agencies may not have their own funding to resource national rosters, the idea of being able to tap into collaborative rosters of shared resource. And I was just wondering, you know, you said that staffing had been less of an issue on this response. I mean, it was raised as one of the challenges, but not one of the critical ones. Did you get much information in terms of the mechanisms that people were using in country in terms of national rosters, or, you know, any reflections in terms of shared resources?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think what we could see is actually in terms of, and we described that a little bit in the report, but in terms of deployment of staff, actually most organizations mobilize their own existing staff. And in addition, they mobilize their staff from field officers or partners, particularly in the remote areas. So it wasn't really, maybe it's the scale of the disaster, but they were managed to basically, most agencies and organizations managed to mobilize from their existing staff to be active, or on the basis of partners, existing relationships with local organizations, looking at for example, an INGO and a national NGO or a local organization. Also, we had examples where, for example, you know, a local partner of Tier Fund, LAM, they worked with, they integrated a government district, officers like a doctor in public health, and also integrated people in their team from another local NGO. So you had that sort of collaboration at the very local level. But as I said, I mentioned before, many of the organizations did collaborate together, and so they, we don't know how much they collaborated together. I think they did collaborated in terms of working together in the different areas. So there was that sort of level of exchange and collaboration also, perhaps less so than exchange of staff.
Great, thanks very much, Glenn. Okay, I want to make sure I'm giving a chance for people online in the room to also ask questions. So are there any more questions that we can take? And sorry, Saskia, for putting you on the spot. It turns out you didn't have a question. Sorry for that. I think you were maybe responding to the sound question. Great, Marlene, you have 2 questions. Do we need to unmute Marlene? Oh no, she's
yes.
Hi.
Hi, good morning. I work with Inside Share, and we are participatory video specialists, and we just carried out a participatory evaluation in northern Bangladesh over the past few months in collaboration with ActionAid. And so it's been really interesting to hear the findings of your research, because you've been looking very much at kind of like a macro level, whereas we work directly in just 2 communities, so went very much to the micro level. And I was just wondering if in your evaluation you also looked at the kind of collaboration between the government and the aid organizations, because it was really interesting to hear from the community members that many of them weren't aware kind of exactly, you know, what aid was coming through them through the government, what exactly was from aid organizations. And it seemed like there was very little kind of coordination between the two. And also one of the main kind of findings was that a lot of the aid came quite late. So many items that they received at the time that they received them, they were no longer useful to them. And also that there was a real lack of consultation in terms of what type of items were needed, and that they received, again, kind of items that weren't useful. So I was wondering if that kind of, how that matches with what you found.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. No, I think, thanks, Marlene. That's really interesting, because you have really insights. As we said, we looked at the macro. Also, we wouldn't claim we did an evaluation. It was more like a review of what sort of went on. I think firstly on the collaboration, yes. In terms of the planning, the agency said that the collaboration was positive with the government. Then I think in terms of the actual implementation, that's where things were harder. Also because of the lack of funding. So there were a lot of unmet needs. As we said, you know, some agencies said they were only able to fill 30% of the needs. And also, I think it's interesting what you said about the material arriving, response arriving late. Yes, some of the agencies did mention that they had, of course, challenges to reach the areas because of the remoteness. Also, as we mentioned in some of the challenges, the access, that yes, there was problems in reaching some of the areas. Perhaps positively in some areas, because there were local partners on the ground, they could respond relatively quickly. But once again, I think what we found, they weren't able to respond. They weren't able to respond to all of the needs, as you mentioned. And quite interesting, I think that's surprising also, maybe not surprising, that, as you said, what was offered was not always appropriate. I didn't hear that in our research, but it doesn't surprise me based on past experiences. And I think really, that's really great that you had the possibility to go directly into the communities and do this really deep evaluation. It sounds very interesting. I look forward to see it when it comes out. So yeah, no, thanks again for those points. That's what I would add. So yeah, we do agree, and some of the things obviously I agree on. I think on most of the points, and some of the things, yeah, we weren't able to dig deep enough to find out some of those points.
Great, thanks, Glenn and Marlene. Any further questions from those online? Maybe we could take a couple, or yeah.
I think I saw James with his hand up, but I don't know what that means, if he wants to ask a question on that.
A question. We didn't see it on our side. Excellent. Sorry, thanks for flagging that, Glenn. Okay, James, we'll hand over to you. Do we need to unmute James? Sorry, we have all of the control and can mute you all at you can use the search function, I think. You see that, find the participant. There we go. Sorry, James. We'll just unmute you. There you go. Hopefully you can speak.
Right.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, this is James from ActionAid Uganda. My question is around what are the success factors for the collaboration across the different civil society organizations in this particular response? I didn't hear earlier, probably the network was not stable. I didn't hear what the success factors are that contributed to the collaboration across the different civil society organizations in this particular response.
Thanks, James. I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the other question was really around what has worked in your work around early recovery strategies in this emergency sort of responses. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I think that's two good questions. I think on the first one, success factors for collaboration. I think certainly I think one big thing was that the organizations had existing relationships and collaborations. They might not have had formal partnerships, but certainly they were together, for example, in this project through the START network, or participating in the food humanitarian country team or the food cluster. So I think this really was something that really worked. And in some cases, as I mentioned before, many of the NGOs, they had written partnerships, agreements with the local partners in resilience and development that then they could mobilize to respond. So that was certainly, I think, a positive factor. I think also maybe it was also another factor in this case was what people said was that the fact that they did have this joint needs assessment also facilitated a sort of a common understanding of the needs and the approach. So that's sort of what comes up in mind for the collaboration of factors. I think on early recovery, unfortunately, in this crisis, maybe Marlene also could confirm that from her work doing the video evaluation in the community. We from the limited view we had, we didn't see any successful early recovery strategies. The organizations I spoke to and we looked at and discussed with, they said that they basically couldn't secure funding for early recovery at that stage when we did the research. Maybe it's changed, so we didn't really see any successful strategies for early recovery, aside from the fact that people recognized, yes, we need it. That's basically what I would say. In this case, early recovery was one of the weaknesses. Thanks. Thanks, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions from the group?
Yeah.
Yep, okay, we've got one from the group, so I'll just pass over to Mike. Sorry, thanks. It might work from that side, but yeah.
Hi, it's Mike Noyes from ActionAid UK. Just wondering, in terms of when you were speaking to agencies about how they conducted the surge, both in terms of having sort of a fairly heavily male staff trying to deliver women-led responses and a lack of international surge, if there was any sense that people on reflection would do it differently next time, or whether they were saying, under the circumstances and knowing nothing will ever be perfect, we think this worked as well as it could have done.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a good point. I think that what I heard from the agencies was that yes, certainly at the national level, the majority of staff are, I'm making a sort of estimation here, maybe men. So in that case, it's difficult to change overnight. And what they said was that even having men involved at that level did you know, it did lead to some success. A success with the women-led program. Ideally, they would have, you know, more women working for them, and I think it was balanced by the fact that, as we mentioned before, many of the partners are led by women-led organisations. So yes, I think it's something that people recognise, but they also recognise they can't necessarily change it overnight, given the sort of demographics of who is working in the organisation. So.
Great. Thanks very much, John, for that response. I'm conscious of time that we are nearing the hour, so I just want to check if there are any other questions. Final questions, and I know we've had a reminder from the CHS Alliance to share our reports with them, which we absolutely will, in terms of making sure that they're promoted.
Just seeing the response from Marlene that says, yes, about similar findings about early recovery, very weak, although some great responses from community volunteers. Yes, exactly. Also what we heard, you know, of course, the unrecognized volunteers and first responders, as they call, young people going online, researching flood response tips. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Marlene.
Great, and I think we have a question from Petra at Oxfam, who should now be unmuted. Petra, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting presentation. I came in a little late, so you might have discussed this at the beginning. I work on a project called Empowering Local and National Humanitarian Actors. You might have heard about it. It's also being implemented in Bangladesh. And I wanted to learn from you. You said towards the end that you had it was successful in terms of having the intervention and the response gone through the local actors. What were your indicators for that? How did you measure that type of response was better or at least as good as an international response?
Yeah, thanks. No, of course, as I mentioned before, it wasn't an evaluation, so we didn't have indicators per se. It was more a review of what people did. We based it basically on looking at what people on the ground and the feedback they had in terms of how they felt it was if they felt it was a success or not. We weren't able to look at other factors in terms of like, you know, to try and compare it if this would be led at an international level. At the same time, you know, we put also several caveats, limitations on our research, in that we did a broad, rapid review, and also at the same time, we were not, you know, able to go in depth on in many of these issues. Our idea is just to give a broad overview. Also, we do point out that, you know, people viewed it as a success. The fact that it was nationally led, and I think that's also a positive finding. But we also do point out the limitations, that, you know, there were quite some unmet needs there for the response. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have another question from Stacey.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly. Hi, Stacey.
Perfect. Hi, this is Stacey from ActionAid Australia, and I am just wondering whether or not, because we're talking about the women's leadership in humanitarian response and documenting how we're transforming search practices, I'm wondering where the protection component fits within this, because going through, I can't see it as a sector, and it's not really coming out in the text. I'm wondering if in future reports we need to draw that out a bit more so we can highlight those differences as well. And my apologies, because I'm just reading the report quickly now, so I'm sorry for that.
No, thanks, Stacey. I think that's a good point. The protection aspect, yeah, it didn't come out in our research. I'm guessing firstly because disaster where the protection aspect is somehow underrepresented, although it can be a real need. But I'm guessing here I'm guessing that the the approaches of ActionAid, Christian Aid, and the other partners, they do have protection aspects in their responses. There was some work done that we saw, for example, plan on child protection was particularly mentioned. But aside from that, yes, it's perhaps underrepresented. We weren't able to look into it, but it's also what people also highlighted to us as their main areas of work.
Okay, any final questions from those online? Okay. So I guess from my side, I wanted to share a big thanks to Glenn for taking the time to organise this webinar. I think we find them quite useful in terms of having a chance to reflect on the research, and we hope others online did as well. I just wanted to give those of you who maybe haven't heard that much about the Surge project, I just wanted to flag that there are some other opportunities to engage coming up if you would like to find out more about what we're doing. So I think there's we can share a link maybe to this group immediately after to attendees on. I'm just thinking of like a link to our resources if you're interested in accessing them. But we've also got a webinar next week on recruitment practices of NGOs, and it kind of actually is a sector what more we can be doing to support localization of Surge in terms of HR practices. So if you're interested, that was a piece of research led by CAFOD for the project, which is end of next week. And we also we'll have a selection of other tracking pieces coming up. So I know, Glenn, you've been doing one on the Hurricane Matthew response in Haiti. And we also have one on the recent NOT response in the Philippines, which will be coming out later this year. And then just finally,
yes.
Super, thanks Glenn. Just finally to flag as well that the project is aiming to organise a selection of events near the end of this year in October, November on the future for Surge, where we'll be really showcasing evidence from across all of the components of the project over the last 3 years. And really the idea is we want to put kind of propositions or recommendations to the wider sector and donors and governments on how Surge in the sector can be improved and made more effective based on the evidence that we've gathered over that period of time. So if you're interested and would like to find out when those events are happening, please do get in touch with Kadira or myself. And Glenn, was there anything you wanted to add before we close?
No, thanks. And I think thanks again to all the interesting questions, and it gives us also food for thought for our future, these rapid reports that we do looking at Surge practices. So thanks again to everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn. And thanks to you all. And yeah, hopefully see you at the next webinars. Bye-bye.